Hello, and welcome back To Lead is to Learn, the podcast where we explore the dynamic world of leadership together. Whether you're a returning listener or joining us for the first time, I'm truly grateful you've chosen us as your companion upon your leadership development journey. Our mission here is simple: to empower you with the knowledge, skills, and insights needed to excel in leadership. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to welcome each of you, whether this is your first time or you're a regular listener. Each of you are a valued member of our community. Your trust in us is invaluable, and it's a privilege to contribute towards your growth. Speaking of growth, did you know that To Lead is to Learn is brought to you by Lambda Solutions? At Lambda, we specialize in leadership development and coaching, dedicated to empowering individuals like you to become the best leaders possible. If you're ready to elevate your leadership skills, or if your organization is seeking guidance to achieve its leadership goals, I encourage you to explore the Lambda way by visiting our website at www.thelambda.co.uk to learn more about how we can directly assist you. Thank you for being part of our community. Together, let's continue learning and growing. And remember, following and sharing our podcast can help us grow our community and impact even more leaders. In today's special episode, we will be talking to an experienced leader about their experience of leadership, challenges they have faced, and any thoughts and visions for the future.
Managers unconsciously get away with all kinds of behaviors. There's always a point where leaders might say, well, there's no way I have that time. Feedback typically triggers a knee-jerk reaction from people who had bad experiences in the past. It's because safety can't be created by saying it exists, but you have to earn that right to get these critical answers there. If the attention of senior leaders isn't consciously planned, people start competing for attention. If a person hits KPIs while burning out the team, the odds are very high that this person can get a promotion. I literally felt like every minute I needed to spend on that game was like it just sucked all the energy out of me. So you have to avoid that moment when the Coke bottle bursts. That only works if you don't have too many direct reports.
Without further ado, here's Joris Merks-Benjaminsen, leadership trainer and coach, transformation expert, and award-winning author, sharing the principles of leading without power. So my first question that I ask everyone on the podcast is that everyone has a story of how they got to where they are today. Do you mind sharing yours with us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes, I've had a corporate career of about 22 years, of which half or so was at Google. And it brought me kind of to what I do now. So now I'm a self-employed trainer of leaders and management teams. And I think there were something like 3 pivotal moments that contributed to what I do now. The first one was actually the transition into work life. So I used to be a competitive judo player, like at university and even from the age of 5, 6. Did that for 20 years. And then somewhere around the moment when I transitioned from university to working life, I got myself injured. Like my knee got broken and I had surgery several times. And at some point couldn't practice judo anymore. That was the same moment I kind of went into working life and had to give up judo. And I was at the time shocked because I came from this focused, disciplined mindset of a competitive sports person into working life that to me felt like extremely messy and also political. And then all the goals that really matter kind of fade away in all that messiness. So the first few years or so, I initially even felt like, well, I'm just not built to work in an office. And then bit by bit, I got my feet on the ground and learned how to focus on the goals that really matter under any type of pressure. So that helped me build like success as an individual contributor. And then somewhere mid-career or so, I got a role which was at Google at the time already. And it was an evangelist role called Head of Digital Transformation. And I worked with Google's largest advertising customers. So those are the ones who spend loads of money on YouTube advertising, search advertising, etc. And they typically had very large marketing organizations, and they had to go through digital transformation. So they were used to running TV commercials, traditional marketing in brick and mortar stores. And then e-commerce comes around the corner. The consumer starts orienting online, buying offline, and vice versa. Mobile came in, and that required them to change their organization from traditional to what they call digital first. And I would be running workshops with them to initially focus on strategy, helping them to create a change plan, but also a strategic change in how they build marketing campaigns, how they measure, how they use automated tools, etc. And they would say all the right things. They knew exactly what needed to happen for that transformation to be a success. And then I did that for 3, 4, 5 years. And the same customers kept getting back in my workshops. And the same discussions happened, same actions came out, and nothing had changed. And so that frustrated me at the time. And there was a certain moment when it hit me why this was happening. It was because of internal competition. So you had the traditional marketing department, typically where the chief marketing officer also was. They were the largest teams. They had all the power. And then you had these e-commerce departments coming up, led by the chief digital. And one was gradually getting more resource, while the other one was getting less resource. And then eventually somehow that needs to merge. And by now we've reached a point where many chief digital people became chief marketing officers. And at the time, I think the people still in power, they didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to lose their power. So they ended up internally competing at the cost of the customer experience, but also at the cost of the long-term future of the company they work for. And so when that hit me, I wrote my first marketing book. It was called Schizophrenic Marketing. And essentially saying like, well, this is ridiculous. You have the same customer, that customer uses all channels, and you work for the same company, and now you compete internally at the cost of both. And that book won the award of best marketing book at the time. So I knew, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy with these observations. I saw people doing things, and actually they were not being happy about that either. Like if you know what needs to happen and you're still not doing it, at some point, meaning in work goes away. So I started focusing more on the human aspects of organizational change. And around the same time, I became a manager, also at Google. And I started building a track record of highest manager scores in the feedback evaluation from the team towards the manager. So at Google, every 6 months, as part of the performance evaluation of the manager, the team needs to assess the manager on the 10 behaviors of great managers. And at some point, by the end, I built a track record of 12 consecutive 100% scores from the team, which is like only a handful of people at the company probably ever achieved that. And people started noticing that. And therefore, I started training managers and leaders around me. And at the same time, I discovered through that work with customers that when you want to solve the people challenge, you want people to be able to internally collaborate, not compete, to investing long term, not opportunistic short term and siloed behavior, then everybody points to the leader. And then you go one layer higher, and that person also points to their leader. So I just realized by that combination of getting those manager feedback scores and that particular experience, like if you want to change anything around an organization, you're going to have to work with the formal manager and leaders and start as high as you can. And that's when you create the space where people can do the right things, where they can invest long term, where they can invest in culture, where they can collaborate rather than compete, because it starts to pay off and then it's easier. And if you don't do that work going through senior management, trickling down, creating that space, then people will say all kinds of things that need to happen, but they won't do it. And that eventually led me to what I do now. So I train managers, leaders, start as high as I can, and then make them conscious of the consequences of their leadership choices and how that either creates a space where people do the opportunistic things, or it creates a space where they can do the right things.
It's interesting you said, actually, there, I circled it when I was making some notes there about the 10 behaviors of managers that Google had at the time. Do you remember what those 10 were?
Yeah, I don't know them like as a 100% list. And it doesn't really matter which exact ones they are, because in the end, wherever I go, I introduce the concept of upward feedback from teams towards their manager. And the exact list doesn't really matter. The most important thing is that it's directly from the team to the manager, which is different from an engagement survey, because an engagement survey is more about the organization, the company, and then maybe sometimes it has some questions about the manager, but the manager can hide a bit in those results. So it has to be directly from the team to the manager. And then the other thing is that it needs to be very specific behaviors and a combination of quantitative results and qualitative. So I have a lot of companies who say they gather feedback from teams towards their managers, but it's qualitative. And then people are hesitant to be critical on their manager because it's not anonymous. You can trace back who said what. And so you need the quantitative bit and very specific on behavior. An example behaviors of the ones in the Google survey is a good coach, makes clear decisions, gives autonomy, does not micromanage, has career conversations, cares about me personally, cares about my opinion, even if it's different from their own. So it's those types of things. And in that list of statements, there are also tensions. So for instance, autonomy versus decision maker. The strong decision maker happens on the moments when there's a decision to be made that doesn't make everybody happy. So every now and then, people are going to have to accept something that is not their choice. But if you do it in the wrong moment, it's perceived as micromanagement. And these tensions, they help applying the behaviors rooted in reality with situational behavior towards your team. And it also means that there's no way you can consistently score high by just being friends with your team. Because if you're just trying to be friends with your team, at some point they just raise expectations to a level that's unrealistic. And then you have to make a tough choice, and then they feel betrayed, and your scores go down again. So these tensions, it has to be very specific behaviors with tensions between them.
It's interesting, the one you mentioned there about the micromanaging versus making decisions when there's a tough decision to be made and it has to be you. So I guess, is it just 2 questions that would be there, or would you have like a whole series of questions throughout the questionnaire, which then help when you get the answer together? It's like, okay, it leans more towards this than this.
So it's a set of 10 behavioral statements used with a 5-point scale to score you on. And then there's one summary statement which says, would you recommend your manager to other people? And then it closes off with 2 open questions. And the first one is, what do you like about what your manager does and what you would like that manager to keep doing? And then what would you have your manager change? And when you get your first round of feedback, those open questions, they get very polite answers. But you will find opportunity in the quantitative statements to improve yourself. So when you share all the results with your team openly, and then you have an open discussion where you're not defensive but curious, and you ask questions, you find 1 or 2 opportunities to change your behavior, and then you actually do it. You make sure that negative feedback doesn't backfire on people. Next round, you get more critical answers also in the open questions. Like the more often you prove that you take the feedback and you change your behavior, then they're going to be more and more and more critical. Then at some point, the answers in the open questions become your most valuable resource. But you have to earn that right to get these critical answers there.
And that comes to the role of feedback and how we take the feedback. Like you said, if you are defensive, straight away they're going to shut down. They're not going to give you honest feedback. So it's really important that first time that you have that discussion with your team that actually you're taking the feedback and you're willing to act on it, and you show that you act on it in the future as well.
Yeah, and that's in many things. So like one of my observations, and also one of the things that's, if I could change only one thing, that's the thing I change, because if you don't change that, nothing else works. It's about the hierarchical relation between manager and team, where managers unconsciously get away with all kinds of behaviors that are not good for their teams, and their teams don't tell them. And it starts with very small behaviors. Like if you have a one-on-one meeting between, for instance, a vice president and someone 2 layers down, then the typical meeting is vice president comes like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes late, is according to expectation. Then the person says, well, I sent you a pre-read. Did you have time to read the pre-read? And then, no, sorry, didn't have time. Please talk me through it. So the person presents, and then the vice president struggles, for instance, with attention because there's an important leadership update straight after that meeting. Goes back with the attention to the story, says, okay, I don't like this, like that, change this, change that. And then says, okay, I need to leave a bit early because I need to prep my next meeting, And this is pretty normal. So that team member also doesn't walk out highly demotivated, doesn't say like next time come prepped, But the reality is this would never have happened this way if it would be a meeting between that vice president and someone 2 layers up. Then that person would have been on time, would have not struggled with attention, would have used those last minutes where he or she could have left earlier to just ask a few questions like, how are you doing? And how are things at home, etc. Like a bit more personal. Would not have just said like, don't like this, change that, etc. But would have made more effort to ask questions like, okay, what other ideas do you have? Why do you want to do it like this and not like that? And then bring a person along based on intrinsic motivation. So there's all kinds of behavior that is very easy to demonstrate downwards, that you would never demonstrate upwards, and that your team doesn't complain about. And so if you then walk to your team and you say, well, give me some feedback, or I have this strategy, does anyone see anything wrong with it, Or more extreme cases when you have harassment cases, you have these senior leaders always saying, yeah, but I've always said to everybody, my door is always open and nobody walked in. Why did nobody tell me? But it's because people don't like confronting their seniors. They don't like expressing something towards their seniors that may be riskful. And therefore, you have to actively create an environment where they see they can speak up to you, they can confront you, they can share sensitive things with you, they can give you difficult feedback, and it won't backfire. You will be helpful, you will be listening with your full attention. And this structural manager feedback every 6 months is the perfect mechanism to prove this to your team. If you do this every 6 months, you get these results where they have an opportunity to score you anonymously and then a few open questions. And if you treat that with all the respect it deserves, with all the attention it deserves, and you change your behavior, that's the most powerful signal you can give that opens the door for people to speak up in many even more difficult situations.
I like in that example you went for as well, where the vice president was late and then he left early, he was distracted. It's the subtle cues you're giving to the other person that I don't value your time, I don't value what you're saying, I have other priorities, I'm just here to show that I'm here.
Yeah, and it's almost never out of ill will, like these are not bad people. They all say in trainings, like the first thing they say is, I care about my team, I care about people, etc., etc. And then I gradually start pushing them, but like, okay, but what is it that you actually do? And 9 out of 10 times when I work with really senior people, because it's worse the more senior you get, people tell you less the more senior you get. And they also start saying things that they think you may want to hear, which makes it very difficult to hear all the important sounds that you need to hear from your organization. And they always say they care about their team. And I'm really sure this is true, but it's very easy to drift away from that with very small steps if you're not sufficiently conscious.
Are you ready to take your career, leadership, and personal growth to the next level? Whether you're a team leader navigating challenges, a CEO shaping the future, or a professional seeking clarity and development, coaching is the key to unlocking your full potential. At Lambda Solutions, we provide expert coaching to help you think, grow, and lead with confidence. We create the space you need to reflect, strategize, and overcome obstacles, because great leadership starts with personal growth. Beyond individual coaching, we offer bespoke consultancy packages designed to empower your teams and organizations. An organization rises and falls on its leadership when individuals feel supported, challenged, and given the opportunity to grow. They thrive. And when they thrive, they drive the success of the organization. Developing your organization's leadership is key to unlocking this potential. So, why wait? Invest in yourself and your future today. Visit www.thelambda.co.uk to explore how we can support your leadership journey. Let's learn, grow, and elevate your leadership potential together. In terms of the sort of feedback that, let's say, that vice president should be looking for, what sort of feedback and how should they go about getting that feedback then? Let's say they've done that meeting. What sort of feedback should they do afterwards? Because they've already sent those messages out. So many of the leaders that will be listening to this, they may be reflecting, going, oh, actually, I've done that a few times. So how could they then approach getting that feedback to be able to change their approach in the future?
Well, the easiest structural solution is implementing that upward feedback survey. And Google has actually open sourced theirs. So if you look online and you search for Project Oxygen, 10 behaviors of great managers, they have literally published the survey Google uses. You could use it without changing anything or just change small words so it fits you better or your organization better. And it's like you can instantly apply it. So that's a nice structural mechanism. But I have another concept that I use in my trainings. I call it moments of the truth. So you have this when leaders say, this is a safe space, you can say anything, my door is always open, And then typically people don't open their mouth and they don't come through the door when something difficult is happening. And it's because safety can't be created by saying it exists. You need to create it through your behavior consistently in the moments of the truth. And like with that feedback mechanism, you actually create deliberately a fixed rhythm of a moment of the truth. But there's loads more of them. Like any moment when you present a strategy and you ask your team, like, hey, what do you think? And one person speaks up, they disagree. Even if they're wrong, if you dismiss that slightly too casually, the next person won't open their mouth anymore. So you're going to have to find a way to ask lots of questions. And then if you believe the person was genuinely wrong, you can still say it, but how you say it deeply matters. So if you internalize the feedback and then find the right way to explain, okay, here's why I disagree, and this is why I think we should go that way. If you do that the right way, then people feel like, okay, this person genuinely listens, even if they disagree, and they value the fact that we brought this point, even though they disagreed. And that's when people start opening up. And there's loads of those moments of the truth. Like you have a moment of conflict in your team, or a top-down decision that's not nice for the team, a reorg, someone leaves the team. Every moment you give the team feedback, for instance, is a very important moment of the truth. So I've worked in many organizations where there's a harsh performance system. And the performance system demands that you give feedback to your team with a certain frequency. And then the manager starts ticking that box of the structure of the performance system. So like once a quarter, they come, okay, I have some feedback for you. And then the feedback they give you is not the one where you see, okay, this person genuinely understands who I am and genuinely tries to tell me something that helps me grow. But it's just feedback that ticks the box or that helps them sell a performance rating, for instance. And so every time you give someone feedback where people feel like, looks like tick the box, you burn trust. Every time you give someone feedback, positive or negative, doesn't really matter. And they see this person genuinely made an effort to see who I am, how I function, and what words help me internalize what I need to hear and help me grow. The more personal you can do that from the heart, even if it's very tough feedback, it will build trust. So you need to develop that skill to spot all these moments of the truth that happen. Some of those you can control, some of those you cannot control. And then consistently do the right thing in those moments. And that's when safety starts emerging and people start speaking up to you in a way that's valuable to you and also to the organization and the team.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the feel of box ticking, because let's say like someone listening went and found the Google form, they sort of adapted it and then they sent it out. That could almost seem like, oh, this is a box ticking exercise, unless it's been preloaded with a bit of communication as to why we're doing it and what the aim of doing this is for. So I guess it comes to being honest and open and sharing why you're looking for feedback and why you're going to maybe give feedback. For example, if you give reasons behind it, that's the moments of truth that you're talking about, rather than just, okay, let's just do this to try and get some feedback. Because on the other side of that, that's just going to feel like, okay, it's a box ticking exercise. Nothing's going to happen from this. I might not even bother filling out the survey.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. I've actually had many managers around me who became manager primarily because it was the next step in their career and not necessarily for their teams. And it was a mandatory survey. They had to do it. And they treated it as a tick the box. also knowing that it affected their performance evaluation. And the way you could, for instance, see that is there was one question in the survey that said, my manager has had a meaningful career conversation with me in the past 6 months. So what these managers who were the tick the box type did is plan that career conversation a few weeks before the performance cycle. And then that feels like a tick the box conversation. So people are still going to score you low on it. And I actually find like once every 6 months is a good frequency. So when I had the conversation with my team, I was a remote manager. I worked in the Netherlands. My team was an EMEA team and nobody was based in the same country. So what I used to do is I used these career conversations as a moment to also spend quality time with all the people. So I would fly to them. We would go for a forest walk. And part of that was just socializing, getting to know the person more deeply. And then amidst all of that, we would typically sit down for lunch and then the focused career conversation would happen. And I did that roughly every 6 months because that's roughly how fast things change. It doesn't change much faster. So I would ask them, once I had the conversation, somewhere after 4 or 5 months, I would say, is now approximately a good moment to plan your next conversation? And then sometimes they said no. I said, well, I'm fine. Our last conversation was perfectly fine. It's still relevant. And then I would skip the conversation. And so factually, it didn't happen, but I still scored 100% on it every single time. And so vice versa, someone else could maybe plan it with that fixed frequency, but do tick the box. And factually, it did happen, but they would still score low. So people don't score you on your tick the box behavior. They score you on the meaning you create, on the value you create.
It's the intention behind it. You're trying to connect personally with them. The forest walk, like you said, I love that idea. I think that's great. But going out and just, I'm connecting with you. And as part of that is, what are your goals? What are your aims? What can I do to help? What can I do to maybe clear the path for you to be able to grow?
Yeah. Another example is in the conversation. So I used a framework where some managers asked, where do you want to be 5 years from now? Most people don't know how to answer that. So what I would typically do is start in the here and now. And like, what aspects of your job do you get energy from? What aspects do you lose energy from? And then what do you want more of? What do you want less of? How can we stretch your role further? When we have reached the limits of stretching, what would be a nice next role in the team? What would be a nice next role outside of our team? What could be a nice role outside of this company? So I gradually move outwards. And then once you're in like, what would you do if money were no object? Then you are at that 5-year scenario, but you've gradually brought people there. And then you move back to the here and now. What seeds can we plant now that help you prepare for desirable scenarios? And a lot of managers that I've trained, when they hear me saying what jobs would be nice outside of this team, what jobs would be nice outside of this company, they fear, okay, but that person might leave. And that's, again, box ticking behavior. This is a conversation for you to help understand that person. And so that information about what they do after your team, when they're no longer relevant to you, is highly relevant for that conversation and understanding who they are. And if you fail to ask those questions in a way so that people open up to you, you miss information that help you create an environment where these people work with you based on intrinsic motivation as long as it's good for them. So the thought is very often, oh, but people might leave. The reality is they leave earlier if you don't know all of these things, because you can't help them. There's nothing wrong with people leaving as long as they leave on the right moment for them, after you've done everything you can to give them a great journey in your team.
Yeah, you said the reality, like everyone's going to leave maybe on a shorter time if they don't feel valued.
Yeah.
But the idea is everyone's going to leave anyway. Like, no one stays in a job forever. So you're there to get the best out of them while they're there. And these sorts of conversations allow them to feel like they can do the best work, they can move on, and you've created a culture that people want to move into.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that approach to one-to-one meeting, the really personal touch. And the way you describe the questions in terms of building the bigger picture, because it's so hard. It's the blue sky thinking, isn't it? If money was no option, what would you do? Like, it's that question, like, if you win the lottery, what do you do? Everyone's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you build it up a little bit, people can then start imagining the next step up. It's easier to do that step than it is to go all the way up.
Yeah, most people get there as long as the questions are genuine. If you have genuine interest and they see that you're internalizing it, listening, summarizing back, and like people will never tell you that they are considering leaving your team if they think it might backfire in performance evaluations later, that you skip them for promotions because you have told you are about to leave anyway. If they have only 1% thought that you might use the information the wrong way, they're just not going to tell you.
And I love the coaching approach, because it is a coaching approach if you think about it. It's what more of, less of that idea of like, how can I help you? And I think it's the idea that people think coaching is someone externally coming in and helping me, but actually you as a leader should be coaching your team. So are there any other approaches in terms of coaching that you implement in these one-to-one or maybe group meetings that you might have?
So there is a question also in the manager feedback survey, is a good coach? And there's also a question about feedback, but the words coaching and feedback are both words that I never use. Let me coach you sounds like patronizing, and feedback typically triggers a knee-jerk reaction from people who had bad experiences in the past. So if it's feedback, I will typically say, listen, I have an observation. Can I share it with you? And from there, you explore. Or it might just be conversational. You get to topics and you just give your opinion and gradually explore it further. So I rarely call it feedback. And the same is true with coaching. So I think the coaching is embedded in all meetings where relevant. When you do coaching training, very often you get taught to ask primarily open questions, And then as a team member, you experience that you just want advice from your manager, for instance. And then the manager says, well, what do you think? And you feel, okay, my manager has been to a coaching trainer. So coaching includes just saying, you know what, I think that option is better. We've talked through all options. If I would be in your shoes, I would choose that one. That's also part of coaching. So I think if you take a broad mindset to the concept of feedback and coaching, you can embed it in every single touch point you have with your team members. And it's mostly just having your focus and full attention with them and giving them whatever they need to be effective and to grow.
Yeah, I think when you have an idea as a leader and you're working maybe one-to-one or with a group, there's the concept that actually, if I share straight away my idea, I shut down their ideas. So I need to open up the table for them to then me come in later and say, actually, from what you've said and what I think, this is my thoughts. What are you now thinking about that? So we've opened up the dialogue that they're willing to share their ideas. They've heard that you've actually listened. You've then put in your idea and you're now asking for feedback from them as well. So it's always this conversation rather than the ultimate leader just going, oh, well, we're doing this. Or as you said, the overly coaching. What do you think? Okay. Which one should we do? Like you've never put anything into it.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that if you state too early your opinion, it's more likely that people shut down. But that's also in the context that many managers and leaders don't consistently invest before in that space where people know they can always speak up. And so if you consistently invest in that space, the risk of people shutting down when you express your opinion becomes lower. But still, I would probably, whenever I can, I would state it a bit later. But what I also see very often is people, leaders, deliberately not stating their opinion, asking these open questions, but then in the end, they already made up their mind. And people feel even worse if that happens.
Yeah. So it's being open to changing, still having your ideas and opinion, but being open to changing. But I guess as well, if the team have put input and you've come up together with a shared thing that maybe you're not happy with, it's your responsibility as the leader still to take the hit. If it, let's say it fails, it falls on the floor. It's like, well, we had an idea share, but it was my decision to go along with it still.
Yeah. Whatever you do, but you have the spectrum like completely open and done deal, and there's a whole spectrum between it. And as long as the position you take, what you say is genuine, people will feel good about it. So if you say, you know what, I thought about this strategy, I'm 90% certain that this is the route. So unless you can prove to me that I've overlooked something critical, this is the route we're going to go. That's perfectly fine if that's genuinely the truth.
Something you said earlier as well was actually quite interesting. The idea that if someone asks open questions all the time, the person who is on the other end of that is almost like, okay, this person's gone on coaching training. I think there's a lot of leaders that have done that. They've gone on like a day retreat or something. They've learned something new. They come in and they try and overtly do that thing straight away. And it suddenly just gets like, everyone's like, whoa, this is different. This is strange. This is unusual. So if there is a leader that's out there listening to our conversation, they've maybe gone on some training recently, how can they implement something without it suddenly getting that knee-jerk, okay, something's off here reaction from their team?
I think every single thing that you've learned or something you can already do needs to be applied with personal situational awareness, because the needs of different people are completely different. And maybe even the needs of one particular person in different moments could be different. So if one person gets a certain amount of support on one project, they might feel like, oh, you're just micromanaging me. The same person on a different project might actually feel like it's valuable support. So everything you do needs to be done with personal situational awareness. And the only way to build that is spend enough regular time with your team. Do that with full attention, show up, use some time in most touch points on the person, not just go transactional on the content straight away. Try to balance the human and the content in every single touch point that you have when you can. And bit by bit, you start to see more how people tick. And that helps you apply whatever skill you've learned or can already do with situational personal awareness. And the upward feedback survey is, again, one of these mechanisms where sometimes your team will say all the same thing, like this needs to change. But more often, some people will actually like this and others don't like the same thing and they want something else. And you start seeing in their feedback what they need in terms of situational awareness.
Going with what you said with your team, because you said you were remote and they weren't necessarily, you weren't working with them. You'd fly out to have these one-to-one discussions with them. But let's say, because it's a reality now that most people have either hybrid or are distant sort of from their team. They're not necessarily in the same room, in the same building. So how can you make sure that you're spending this time with your team, like you said, where you're observing, you're not necessarily in a conversation with, but you're observing how they're working and how they react to your interaction with them if you are remote?
So most of what I do is what I call it planned attention. So you have to be very deliberate to kind of plan out who are the people I'm responsible for, including your stakeholders actually, and then deliberately planning your meeting cadences. So I would typically have once a week with every person that directly reports into me, I would have a one-on-one meeting, which is an hour long. That only works if you don't have too many direct reports. So if anyone has 20 direct reports, for instance, there's no way they can build the awareness about their team members that is so high that you actually know them. That also means it's very hard to be relevant to them. So I actually think, unless you happen to have a type of job under you where all the people do roughly the same thing, like a call center, you can probably have 20 people. But if they do high complexity jobs, there's no way that you can effectively be relevant for people while having 20 direct reports. So there's an optimum somewhere between 6 and 9 or so. And from 9 and higher, you start to feel like, okay, now I'm struggling with time. Genuinely, there's no way I can give them what they need. So I have these one-on-ones, 1 hour every week. We write goals every single quarter. And when you write goals, we use OKRs for that, but there's loads of ways you could write them, objectives and key results, but there's also other methods. When you write these goals, you also attach names of the leaders for each project, and there's the supporting people. And as a project group, they will also design a meeting cadence, which has maybe a weekly cadence or bi-weekly or whatever. And in their journey, there are certain milestone moments. And then you can deliberately plan to join them on certain milestone moments. And for some project teams who are on work that you know is just going to go well because you've done it before, you might join them a bit later. Whereas other teams are exploring something completely new. You know they're going to go through a rough phase in the beginning. So you might join them every single week in the beginning until you see, okay, this is rolling nicely. And then you just start hopping in and out meetings and see how people collaborate with each other. And then you have your one-on-ones. Then like twice a year, you fly to people if you're remote and you meet them. During COVID, I didn't have the option to fly to people. So then we would still do the career conversations and we would agree that we would still go for a walk somewhere in a nice environment with headphones on. And then the conversation is still very different than when you have it over video call. like any other normal meeting. So if you consistently plan your attention this way and you use it with your full attention, show up on time, that's when you start seeing all the interactions between people, but also seeing people as individuals.
It's a very intentional approach, and I kind of like that. And the fact that you're planning when and where and how, and you're creating this space. So when you're talking about in COVID, you still went on walks with the headphones in. You're still being very careful to create the environment which is conducive towards the type of conversation you want to have, rather than just, okay, well, we're just going to be in our living room that we're normally working in while COVID, and we're still having the same conversation, because that just feels like a meeting rather than a conversation. So it's a very intentional approach that you're sharing here, which I definitely resonate with, and I hope the listeners do as well.
Yeah, it is time intensive. So there's always a point in my trainings where bit by bit I go through, like, this is, what it takes to get a high performing team and a high performing organization. There's always a point where leaders might say, like, well, there's no way I have that time. But the reality is it's actually an individual contributor mindset, because there is nothing that you as an individual can do that is more impactful, more efficient, faster than what a high performing team can do. And the only problem is that these are investments that pay off later. So you have to spend the time first. And then if you do that consistently, the team starts functioning really well and they become the foundation for you to stand on. And then you can focus on other things again, like building out the influence of your team, for instance. But if you don't make these investments, then at some point they're going to circle back to you. Then people who you want to stay, they leave earlier than you would have liked. People who you want to leave, they stay. They spiral down, they become these difficult cases, and then by the time you confront them, they call in sick. And that stuff will circle back to you on a moment you can't control. And then it's going to suck out more time than it would have cost when you invest earlier.
Yeah. You're intentionally planning time in so that you don't get the ad hoc interventions that you need to do in the future, which then sap the 5 to 15, the 30 minute sort of slots throughout your day when you're thinking, I actually had to do X, Y, and Z, but now I have to do this instead.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a level of being organized, I guess, that as a leader you have to be to have this intentional approach, so that in my diary for the next 6 months, these are the times where nothing else can go in. I have to block these out because I'm investing in my team, rather than I am willing to do a client meeting here, but I'll just, John will have to wait. It's actually, no, John is a priority. My client meeting will fit in and around that, because my investment in John is bigger than my investment in this client.
Yeah, true. I've heard from quite some leaders who are of the type that don't really like structure. And for those, it might feel like, if you hear this method, where I use loads of structures to create consistent behavior, and it may sound almost like you get tired by hearing, but the reality is you may not like structure as a person, but every team needs structure to a certain level. And so if you then say, you know what, I'm just not a structure person, then your team probably won't confront you with it, but there will be negative consequences for your team. You need to start applying at least the minimum amount of structure that gives the team a sense of direction, And if you don't apply structure to how you spend time with people, then some people will be smart. They will plan lots of coffee chats with you, and they get closer to you. They get all the opportunities, and they come up. And some are like head down, in the work, maybe even more impactful than the other ones. They are less visible for you. So you can't just leave it up to chance. So there's a certain amount of structure, just planning these career conversations every 6 months with every direct report, having these one-ones every week with every direct report. It sounds like a lot, but it's just a cadence, and you can learn through discipline. I was never structured myself. Structured is a learned skill for me. I used to forget everything in university. And it's only once I entered working life that I thought, okay, there's no way I can be impactful if I don't apply more structure. So then, bit by bit, through discipline, I think I've always been disciplined, but I was never structured. I've completely learned that because I just know it's required to be consistently effective.
when you were saying about the coffee breaks, those 5 minute coffee breaks you have every now and then, I think we've all been in a workplace where either we or someone we know has played that game because they know that time is not spent up there. So it's like, oh, if I just go and I pop in, I just have a 2 minute chat with my boss, suddenly you become the favored one.
Yeah.
Other people know it's like, oh, you will always get beneficial behavior.
And it has massive consequences for the effectiveness of your organization. If the attention of senior leaders isn't consciously planned, people start competing for attention. And in that competition for attention, they invest more in being visible upwards than doing their job. They invest more in competing than collaborating. So it just harms the effectiveness of your organization, and it also harms the culture of your organization.
And that's the quickest way, I guess, to lose the best performers, but keep the ones that are just doing what they need to do to be visible.
Yeah, I think the best performers are the first to leave because they want to actually focus on their work and not have to play that game all the time. So they can also afford to have higher standards for culture and for effectiveness.
And this goes back to what you said when you came into the work environment, the political atmosphere that you found there. This is very much politics, isn't it? It's like playing the game and making sure that you're ticking the boxes you need to tick and just bubbling along with the rest of it.
Yeah, true. And in my first years, I literally felt like every minute I needed to spend on that game was like it just sucked all the energy out of me. And as I progressed as a professional, became more mature, I've learned there's no way you can do none of it. Like every large organization has some political elements in their culture, so there's no way you can completely ignore it. You're gonna have to dedicate time on that game. So I try to do that structure too, so it wastes as little of my time as possible, so I can focus as much as possible on the work. So I'm realistic there. But then still there are certain principles, if it starts to harm what you're supposed to do too often and too much, then you're going to have to think like, is it still worth staying here, or are there different places where I can be more impactful?
I want to circle back because it seems to be a common theme from all the people that I actually interview on the podcast that there always seems to be a sporting background to almost everyone who is in the leadership space or a successful leader. So yours was competitive judo. What skills do you think you picked up by doing that for such a long time in your formative years have led you to being a successful leader in the future?
I think the biggest thing is staying focused under any kind of pressure. So if you think about judo, you have to stay balanced. You have a certain game plan when you enter, but then your opponent also has a game plan and tries to disrupt yours. So you're pulled in all kinds of directions. You're physically under threat. You can get injured. And despite all of that, you just have to stay quiet and calm in your head. You need to stay balanced. You need to stick to your game plan. And so I kind of, when I navigate complex organizations and there's always too much work, people want different things from you, you're being pulled in all kinds of direction. Staying quiet, staying rooted to the goals that you have committed to, while at the same time being flexible when you can, I think that skill definitely is something that I've been able to build on as I progressed.
It's an individual sport as well, isn't it? So you said about you remaining balanced and remaining calm and all of the different directions being pulled in, and you need to make sure that you remain centered and that you keep focused on your goals. How did you adapt to letting others in and letting others be your priority as a leader when you've got this background of very much focusing on you being able to be successful?
This was mostly hard in my first years before I became a manager. And the thing I struggled with most is I think I'm quite a bit more disciplined than the average person. And in university, if people would just mess around in my eyes, then I would just not spend time with them. I typically would go to the gym alone because most people, when you try, oh, let's go together, then you call, okay, shall we go? Oh, no, I don't feel like it. And it just wasted my energy. So I would typically just go alone. I said, oh, I'm going now. No doubt. Here I go. And that attitude doesn't work when you have to work with colleagues. You can't just pick and choose who you want to collaborate with. And I also found it hard to trust people in the beginning. There's the lack of discipline also leads to situations where people say they're going to do X and then they don't do it. And then I would instantly feel like, okay, I can't trust this person. So I've gone through quite a few years where I've just learned to accept that not everybody has the same level of discipline, and that many people say X and do Y. And the thing that solved it for me is that, first of all, discovering that there's no bad intention behind it. At least most of the time there's not. There's only a small group of people who does it with bad intention, and they typically spoil it for the rest. So most people have good intentions. And then you can most of the time also predict if people are not going to do what they say based on their incentives, pretty much. Like, what are the pressures on them and what pays off for them? And so I've learned to assess whatever behavior pays off for people. And so, for instance, I have a way of organizing my email. I have certain labels. And one of the labels is when I send an email, I mark it blue when I think the person is not going to respond. Or I put, like in my diary, I will say, okay, remind that person then and then, because I just know they're not going to do it if the topic is secondary to them. So I've just learned to deal with it, make it predictable, and also just accept it like it's not bad intention. But then later, when I became a manager, suddenly it was very easy because the needs of my team were my needs. Like, I just knew that the most meaningful thing I do is the impact of the team. And also I had more control. So I could, wherever discipline and structure is missing, I could create it. So the more senior you become, the more influential you are in creating the environment that you feel works best. So it was particularly hard in the beginning.
You also said earlier, and I don't know if it applies to you, but you said that most people get promoted because of how good they are at their job, and it's the next stage in their career. And there's very little training on leadership and how to approach other people in that first step, maybe the second step. It's only when you're higher up do they suddenly invest in leadership development training. So you said you found it hardest to start off with. What were the key moments during those first year, 2 year, 3 years of your leadership where you suddenly went, okay, I'm now managing people. I now need to adapt my approach a little bit to accommodate for them, to now put in some structures to allow them to maybe become a little bit more of the way that I would like to work with them. Like, how did you learn that?
So I think I've been lucky in terms of with the amount of training I've had, because like Google is a company who invests in managers quite early on, even to a point where in the beginning you have to do so many trainings that you feel like, okay, when can I actually do my work? But still, what I've experienced is that the trainings I got were all on isolated topics. So for instance, you would have one training about giving feedback, one training about writing OKRs, there was one training about the performance system, and nobody related all of those together. Whereas the ability to do fair, predictable performance evaluations very much depends on how you set expectations up front and how you give people feedback during the year towards that moment of performance evaluation. So there's a very clear connection between all of these topics. So I ended up actually solving the puzzle for myself. And there's also many topics that I never got training on. Like an example is how to discuss and cultivate good team habits. It's something that very few managers get trained on. I did get trained on interviewing techniques, but like most other companies, they don't do things about interviewing, which is a very important skill for anyone who hires people. So I kind of looked at where are the gaps, where are the connections between all the topics, and gradually built out my own toolkit. And then the upward feedback was actually my most important tool that helped me. And it helped me uncover blind spots, for instance. So I have this discipline and structured way of working. And for instance, it applies to how I do email. Like, I always end every single day with an empty inbox and an empty to-do list. So when someone sends me an email, I will probably reply within minutes or maybe an hour or two latest. And I thought that I was helping my team with this, that I was being of service to them. And I've discovered through my feedback that this is true for some people, but some people also get stressed from it. Because when someone is your manager, you feel obliged to read whatever they write. So they would write an email, then in 5 minutes, so bam, there's an email back. And they feel obliged to read it and respond again. And before you know it, emails fly back and forth. And it distracts them, they get nervous, etc. So I've actually learned that on some moments I create value by responding fast, Whereas on other moments, I might just say, I've seen your message. I've parked it in our document discussing our one-on-one. Great work, thank you. And that's it. So they don't feel this need. And there were loads of those topics where I just discovered there's a downside of something I try to do. And then I've learned to flex it more to situational or personal needs.
I mean, that's interesting, the one you said about the sending emails. I was just there going, imagine if the person on the other side of that email was just like you and they couldn't leave work with an email unread and undealt with, and you're there the same. It's just,
yeah.
Work keeps going forever.
Yeah, the loop goes infinite. Yeah.
But I was just thinking there as well, like it's the pace that you're working at in that sense. Like it's the urgency that you send a message you portray to them. And I think that's important within leadership development training, isn't it? The understanding of what does your action have in terms of the impact on them rather than just the impact on you. Because I think when you first come into leadership, you're more worried about how do I come across to other people rather than how does this impact them?
Another example is related to it, sending emails in the evening. So loads of leaders, they routinely send emails like whenever they work, and that's typically also outside of working hours. And I have that discussion with every group of leaders I'm in. And then typically when they are conscious about it, they say, well, I've talked about it with my team. And I said, I don't expect you to reply. And that solves it for them. But the reality is, even when you say this, there will be a part of your team, maybe not everyone, but there will be a part of your team. When you send an email in the evening, even if you said you don't expect them to read it, they still feel the pressure to do so. And then there might be something in that email that triggers something for them, and then they have a stressful evening. So I've become very deliberate about just not sending emails in the evening, and it's very easy not to do so because they're scheduled sent. So I've explained to my team, like I do work in evenings, and very often that's because of work-life balance reasons, because I have kids and I bring them to school in the morning, so I start a bit later, we eat at 5, so I stop a bit earlier, and then I churn out some emails in the evening, right? So this is why I do it. And then I use schedule send, so it arrives for them in the morning, just because I know when I send horizontal emails, it's a bit less of a problem because the hierarchy is not there. But as soon as you do it top down, then no matter what you say, people might feel pressure to read, and it might cause an evening of stress for them. And that's what I try to avoid. I had the same thing during holidays. So I often felt good just keeping my empty inbox during holidays. So I just feel more relaxed, and I come back after holiday not having this backlog of work, and then it takes loads of time to get into your disciplined rhythm again. And I also thought I was helping my team by doing that. And then they gave me the feedback in my survey, well, you kind of set a standard now that people are expected to work during holidays. So I also became more thoughtful about doing that.
It's the idea that they're going to try and emulate the behavior that you portray as well. So you set the standard and they then feel they have to reach that standard to then be seen positively by you.
Yeah. And it's not like you can never do it anymore, it's not like you have to hide it, but you just have to be conscious about when you do it, how you do it, and have the conversation regular enough, etc.
I also guess with the whole schedule send bit, that's fantastic, particularly for like when you're saying you're working across teams where people are in different countries and different time zones as well. Because for you, what might be 2 PM could be for them 7 PM, and you feel like, it's during the working day, but for them it's not. So it's their schedule send of like, okay, what time do I want it to land in their inbox so that they can action it?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Great leadership starts with continuous learning, and we've made it easier than ever for you to access powerful insights to elevate your leadership game. Visit www.thelambda.co.uk and navigate to the Lambda Library, where you'll find high quality articles, exclusive previews from my upcoming book, Lessons in Leadership, and full transcripts of these podcast episodes, crafted to spark your imagination, challenge your thinking, and ignite your leadership potential. The best part? It's completely free. It's all part of our dynamic journey of learning, and we can't wait for you to join us. And if you haven't already, make sure to follow the podcast and explore our back catalogue of episodes, featuring incredible guests sharing invaluable leadership lessons real world experiences and strategies to help you lead with confidence and impact. Because when we embrace learning as a fundamental principle, we take our leadership to another level and everyone around us benefits. If any of our content speaks to you, share it with others. Let's amplify the impact of leadership lessons and create a world with more high quality leaders. Okay, coming back to the bit you said about hierarchy, and I guess it's kind of underpinned a lot of what we've discussed about so far. And there's this element of when you have a position, you have power behind you. How do you balance when you utilize that power, when you want that power to just disperse away for about 5-10 minutes, and just to ensure that your team are working to a higher level of performance, but also don't fear working for you? Because power comes with it, this very, you play around with this element of fear, I guess, and there's repercussions there, as accountability. How do you make sure that you're not overbearing with the power, but also you're able to utilize it as and when you need to?
Yeah, when you become a manager, you're expected to give people feedback, you're expected to be a coach, those types of things. But actually, the role of formal manager or leader is a very hard one to do it from. Because by definition, from that role and the power that is connected to it, you create an element of unsafety and people share less with you. And so my book is called Managing Without Power. So I also run my trainings under that particular title. And what I try to say with that is manage and lead as if you don't have the power that is inevitably connected to your role. And it's not like you can never use that power, but try to use it as little as possible. You could actually compare it with a judo fighter. So if kids grow up doing judo and they happen to be physically extremely strong, and they just learn that by overpowering the opponent, they can win at young age. By doing so, they don't develop the versatility of techniques, and they don't develop the skill of feeling their opponent and surprising them in the moment based on their movements. So they don't develop the skill of building a good game plan. And so when I was teaching kids and I saw they were very strong, I would just find ways so they could not use their strength. So I would say, fight with one arm, or I would say, put them against a slightly bigger kid who was a bit older and equally strong. And by doing so, they became much more versatile fighters. And then when they do apply strength, they do it on the right moment and haven't wasted it. And I think that's the same here. Like if you apply strength on the wrong moments, and it's very easy to do so because you have it and people also respect that you have it, you end up not hearing all the sentiments in your team. You end up not building the skill of flexing your leadership style. So you have to deliberately take out the element of power as much as you can, so that when you do it on a moment that it really matters and it has the impact that you want it to have. And the inevitable moment when you always have to do it is whenever you have a performance evaluation, or when you decide on someone's pay, or whether you decide who gets hired and doesn't. That's a moment where you just exert power no matter what. But if you, in all the other moments where you don't have to, are respectful for people, you spend time with them, and it feels shoulder to shoulder to them, they will feel that whatever you do in all these other moments where you inevitably apply power, that it's based on solid principles, based on great intent, etc. And they will trust your moments of applying power.
It's almost like a bank, isn't it? You're sort of taking deposits in to be able to then spend it when you need to, rather than just keep being in your, I guess, overdraft, your power overdraft.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and then also like a bank where you use the time to learn, about the environment, so that when you choose to take the money, invest somewhere, that you invest in the right thing.
That it's going to come back and it's going to pay reward, rather than you're spending it there and it's never going to get reward for you.
Yeah.
So what sort of tools could we use then? You said about in certain moments you have to exert the power. What sort of tools can we use in those other moments so that we don't have to? So if there's a conversation where a decision has to be made, how can you make sure that you're not exerting too much power there and instead you're utilizing that personal approach, like you said?
So I have an exercise I use in my trainings. I call it 10 layers of defense. I typically use it in the context of managing low performers, but it relates a bit to that moment when you have to make some kind of decision where you exert power. Like either you have to rate a person, you have to decide whether to get promotion or not, or you have to fire someone. That at some point that moment needs to happen. And also in that moment, you're going to give them feedback, which includes negative feedback in many cases. And if something goes wrong in a moment like that, for instance, if you need to give someone a performance rating is lower than they expect, and you need to give them some negative feedback that comes with it, if that performance conversation goes wrong, 9 out of 10 times it's because of something that didn't happen before. So in these 10 layers of defense, I kind of sketch down all the steps. It starts at the day a person gets hired. Like, first of all, certain hiring practices to set a really consistent standard for hiring, so hire the right people. Once they come on board, the amount of support you give them. For instance, these career conversations, I use them in a slightly tweaked format when people come on board. I start, instead of asking them what parts of your job you get energy from, what drains you, after a month or so, I meet with them and then I will ask them, like, what parts of the job are different than you hoped. And then step by step, I have these conversations with them during their onboarding. I spend extra time with them in the first 3, 4, 5 months. I keep tweaking projects. If it's not working, then okay, maybe this fits them better, maybe that fits them better, and then you gradually expand autonomy when you feel it's working, etc. So positive feedback, for instance, is also in that early stage. Very often companies who are like high performance companies, they call themselves high performance companies, they have a harsh performance system that demands giving feedback, and they say we need to develop a feedback culture. And typically that means things people could do better. And they kind of overlook positive feedback. But the more investments you make early in the journey, including positive feedback, and not just like, okay, well done, but positive feedback where you've observed something about the person, how they behave, and you can describe that behavior enough detail so they feel, you know what, this person sees me. And you can, from the heart, say, this is the positive impact it has, so this is what I value in you. And the more you do that in the beginning, combined with all the other investments you make, you build up this bank account. And that also buys you the credit to, at some point, while it's needed, and that moment will always come, give them very hard feedback. And in a way, not just like, here's the feedback, then they will just either disregard it, become defensive, whatever, but deliver it in a way so they can, at that point, internalize it and grow from it. Like, the more you invest early, you build the credit to give them harder feedback than anyone else can give them. So it's nothing soft about it either. So with these 10 layers of defense, you just invest early, consistently, and then by the time it is not working the way you need to, then investing is also giving people the difficult messages. And investing can also be firing someone when it's good for the team to do so, or firing someone who is just actually not happy in the job, therefore disengaging, but not willing to leave. At some point, you got to have to make that call. And if you do it too early, it creates unsafety for the team. But if you do it too late, it also creates unsafety for the team. So there's a certain optimum that you need to find. And it starts with investing early. And the more you invest, the fewer people will get to that point. But when they do, you will see it on time, and you will pick the right time and the right way to get them to leave your team.
I guess it's for them as well. If you're firing them, maybe for them, for their benefit, because they're not happy, like you said, they're not performing very well. They must be going home and feeling slightly deflated from their work environment, but they're just like thinking, I just need to get money in to pay the bills. I can't afford to leave. I've only just joined 6 months ago. What's my CV going to look like? It's that bit. Whereas you have that typical conversation with them where it's like, this isn't working out. I can tell you're not enjoying your work. I'll give you a fantastic reference because of X, Y, and Z, being really specific, the things that you are really good at, but this just isn't the right fit for you. We will help you get a job elsewhere. It's that element you've built up. You're given a difficult conversation, but you're utilizing a lot of what you've built up, that bank that you've already built up.
Yeah, and there's like 2 typical ways I see it go wrong, and it relates a bit to the company culture that exists. So I have a matrix that I often use in my trainings, and it has a vertical axis, which is emphasis on humanness, like empathy, time with people, etc. And the horizontal one is emphasis on performance, accountability, structure. And let's say if human is high, but the structure, etc., is low, then you get an organization which I call survival of the nicest. So typically these are people that are nice and social with each other. But then if someone doesn't deliver, they're not held accountable. And so that keeps happening. And that starts to become annoying for some people around that person. And then the finger pointing starts. And then if that takes too long, at some point that organization starts to feel like walking through the mud. And then your high performers start leaving. So that's a type of environment, if you take these 10 layers of defense, where people get typically hired with inconsistent standards. So already in the hiring process, too many people come in that probably don't meet the standard. They do get solid onboarding because in those organizations, typically you have managers that actually care about teams and people and spend time with them. But then clarity of goals, this is what I expect from you, is sloppy. And because that is sloppy, then even though the one-ones happen, and the time is spent with them, the check-in on whether you're delivering what was agreed or not doesn't really happen. So people gradually start drifting off from what they need to do. And then at some point, the team actually starts to notice, hey, like I need stuff from that person. That person isn't giving it. It isn't being dealt with at that moment. So it prolongs until it becomes such a problem that it becomes toxic. And then you need to deal with it and the person calls in sick. That's what you get when you have survival of the nicest. And in the box where human is low and structure performance is high, you have what I call survival of the toughest. So it's people with slightly thicker skin, sharper elbows, who manage upwards at the cost of downwards, who internally compete instead of collaborating, essentially optimizing for their own career, mostly. In those organizations, you typically hire with a high hiring bar, so they definitely filter out some problems there. Person rarely gets good onboarding because all the managers are slightly too busy with time upwards at the cost of downwards. So you're thrown in the deep. You do have objectives and goals, but very often they're just pushed on you top down. It's not like you do it in co-creation. You're not spending enough time discussing what it means for you, whether you understand it, etc. Like it's just like, okay, here's the goal, do it. And then the moment when they see you not delivering on the goal is typically one where you quite soon get harsh feedback, which is a slap in the face in a context where safety doesn't really exist. And then some people actually, they just plow through, they're the ones with the slightly thicker skin. But loads of people who actually could perform, they shut down. Actually, the worst thing is that they disengage and don't leave. Then you're stuck with loads of people who are not leaving but are not engaged. Some people leave, and then there's loads of them who actually gradually get damaged. And then at some point, the leader looks at that and fires the person probably a bit too early without having invested. They could have performed, and they do have friends around them. And the team sees how that person is being treated, and I think, okay, I might be next. So it creates this fear around this person. And both situations are not optimal. There's a certain optimal in the middle, where you're not too late, not too fast. You've done enough investments up front so that everybody sees when that person leaves, yes, I saw it coming, it's fair, and I'm not the next.
That's the high human, high structure sort of meeting perfectly in the middle where there's structure but also a personal touch to it.
Yeah. And hopefully by then, when you confront the person, you still have this high trust relationship. So when you confront them, they don't call in sick yet.
You mentioned about the positive feedback is often overlooked. And I think that's very key that we do provide positive feedback. That's very specific, like you said, where it's like this thing that you did, that was great. And you're not just going, oh, you did really well today. And that's it. That's a bit of positive affirmation, but that's not feedback. Whereas feedback is what you did in this project when you created this and you worked with this person, those real specifics that you're observing. And then when it comes to negative feedback, when you have to give the difficult feedback, the stuff that they need to really work on, what's your approach to that? How would you approach that conversation? Now you've built up this trust bank. What's the sort of approach in that conversation you're doing? Are you inviting them into your office and having a sit down conversation? What is it you're doing?
So when I got feedback trainings when I was a manager, then most of those you would have some kind of conversation framework, which is like a situational behavior, the impact it has, and this is what you do differently or what you need to keep doing. But the reality is that most conversations that go wrong, you don't solve it with the feedback framework. It's all these investments up front. And then, even then, it assumes that you know what's right and that you have the credibility also to give it to the person. But the fact that you are the manager doesn't mean that they see you as credible to deliver them feedback. and you may be wrong because they might have context that you don't have. So when you give feedback, there needs to be space in whatever conversation framework that you use to also explore what it means. And so I've actually started using the BUILD framework in my trainings, because that one, instead of 3 steps, it has 5. Steps 1, 3, and 5 are similar to situation, impact, and here's what to do differently. But the second step is after you've said like, hey, listen, I think I'm observing something. I'm not sure what it means yet, but here's what it is. And then there's a second step where you explore together. Like, do you recognize that? Like, do you understand which situations I mean and what behavior I mean? And what goes on in your head when you do that? And why do you choose that particular option and why not, for instance, another one? So you get more context as you explore it together. And then you might actually discover why the other person is making a fair trade-off in such a moment based on their position. Or you might discover that they have a certain barrier which you can use in the next stages of the conversation to help them get over it. The third step is the same, like, okay, you describe this is the impact. There's a fourth step then where you again explore together, like, okay, do you recognize when you do that, there's an impact? Do you see that? And if you see it, why do you keep doing it? And then the final one where in the regular feedback framework, you would say, this is what you need to change, this is what you need to keep doing. You explore together what options the person has. And I find that a framework which is more like that, conversational, 2 directions, works in many more situations than just the straight route. Whereas if you genuinely know this is what the person needs to hear, I have all the information, then go for the straight route. But there's loads of conversations where the other one has more impact, gives you higher odds of the person internalizing whatever they need to hear so they grow from it.
I think if you're too direct sometimes, particularly if the language being chosen is very accusational, it's very direct, it's very like, you're doing this, it really shuts down the other person having any say in it, being able to explain the context, explain how they experienced it. And it's very much you almost taking the stance that everything I know is right and you have no say in this. And that sends that person into the fight or flight. They're likely just going to sit there silent, take it, walk out of the room. They're going to feel all trust is gone. They're going to want to leave potentially. They're just maybe even disengaged, like we said. And you've taken someone that could easily have changed one tiny little thing because maybe they didn't observe that the other person experienced it this way, whereas they thought it was this way. Like you said, that framework where it's a conversation to start off with, there's no accusations. It was fantastic. You said that I'm observing this, in which case you're saying, I'm observing this. Can you tell me what you're experiencing? Rather than that as a leader saying you, which is very pointing the finger. It's very much, this is what I'm observing. Can you tell me if it's right? Am I missing something here?
Yeah, true. I really like the radical candor framework from Kim Scott. She wrote a book about it. And she uses a similar matrix where you have feedback delivered with personal care on one axis and directness. And what I think she expresses nicely, so I mentioned conversational, but what you should avoid is sugarcoating, right? So in that conversation is still directness. So this balance between personal care and directness is what helps. For instance, it's not like the hamburger feedback or shit sandwich, some people call it.
Yeah.
Here's a compliment, here's negative feedback, there's a compliment. So that would actually be in the box where you try to be too nice.
Yeah.
But directness is gone. And therefore people do not hear what they need to hear very often. So even though it's conversational and you have opening for people to disagree, there's still directness in it.
It's not beating around the bush.
Yeah.
This is still the thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
And you front load it with, I've observed this thing. So, straight away, we're talking about this.
Yeah.
Opening up to them to explain their context in case that clears something up for you or for them.
Yeah. And I like that phrase also, like I've observed something or I have an observation or I have a thought or whatever. I like that more than say, I have some feedback for you. Because that typically triggers the first defensive reaction for people already.
I had a conversation with someone on my podcast before, and it was very much, there was one of the parts in this sort of conversation of giving negative feedback where you throw to the other person, how do you think so-and-so experienced or witnessed that? And it takes the person out of them. And suddenly they're now looking at the situation and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see how me saying that could come across like this.
Yeah, that's perfect. So that would be in the fourth step where you explore the impact it has then pointing, so, okay, what do you think was the impact on that person? What would they say if they would be here?
Yeah, because you could have like a heated discussion over there in one part of the office, but actually like you haven't even thought about what does everyone else who's witnessed that think, particularly if like say you're the middle manager and you've had a stern word with someone in public in front of other people. It's like, okay, how do you think that went down with the rest of the team? What's happened to credibility, this sort of thing, but you're doing it in a nicer way rather than you've just lost all trust. You're not laying out exactly what they've done. They're realizing it themselves.
Yeah, the moment is an important one. So the worst moment is during performance evaluations, essentially. As a trainer, very often I get quite a few requests. Can you do a feedback training because the performance evaluations are coming up? That's an important feedback moment. But the reality is a performance evaluation has to be fair and predictable. And that means two things. Fair means without bias. That means that your impact and your skill predicts what comes out, and not how well you've promoted yourself, how many coffee chats you have with the boss, etc. Not whether you are a tall white male or something else, So without bias, genuinely impact qualities, that's what predicts outcome. And then predictable is you get a rating you expect, an outcome you expect. So if there's a promotion or not a promotion, and you get feedback that you've already heard many times before on a moment when you could still act on it. So if a performance evaluation is the first moment you hear feedback, then there's no way a person is going to trust that you're telling them because you want to help them grow, because instantly has impact, they can't change it anymore, and you should have told them much closer to the moment when it actually happened. And then there's also still too early. So like I call it the Coca-Cola moment. Like if someone made a mistake, for instance, and they're still in the process of internally banging their head against the wall, and then you come, okay, let me give some feedback, that's too early. And could also be the other way around, like you're still frustrated about something, and then the way you deliver it, you're gonna overdo it. So you have to avoid that moment when the Coke bottle bursts because you're slightly too early. Typically that means 1 or 2 days of waiting. So if you then have a weekly one-on-one with people, that is 1 hour, enough time to spend time on the person as well as on the content. No matter what moment something happens, there will always be a 1-1 relatively close to it where you can say, hey, listen, I have an observation. I want to share it with you. So the 1-1 is probably the best moment to give most of the feedback you want to give people. And if an earlier moment is needed or like whatever, you could still plan it as long as you've passed that first Coca-Cola moment.
I think, like you said, the performance review, it happens once a year. And if you're suddenly banking things up and you're bringing it up then, it's like, well, we've had 3 months to change it, deal with it. And you're now telling me that I'm not going to get X, Y, and Z because of something that happens where, as a leader, you should be helping me grow, but actually you're not doing that. You're just telling me now to try and keep me down. And suddenly that person feels like I'm not going to be able to grow in this team. I can't develop. I'm just going to look elsewhere. Whereas on the other hand, if it's too early, that person's, like you said, still in that, they're still seething from it. Maybe they're still like going, oh, I didn't perform. They're beating themselves up about it. They're not ready for that growth moment yet because they're still in the mud.
Yeah.
So you kind of need to find that time.
You will still have people that, despite you mentioning feedback very clearly several times a year, that they just keep ignoring it.
Mm.
So in that case, they will end up in that performance cycle, getting a summary of all the negative feedback and a rating they don't like, but they could have expected it because they've heard the feedback. So they got loads of warning signals. They had chances to change their behavior. So even though they might get a low rating or at least an outcome they don't like, it's still fair and predictable.
I guess as well, it's in those conversations when you're giving the feedback before the performance review, it's very important that you as the leader are making sure that that person understands that you're giving them feedback, that this is something they need to action. It's not just like you're making a comment and then you think, oh, I've given them feedback. If they've got nothing they can actually do because of it, nothing that they should be doing differently, where you can then observe and say, you've done this or you haven't done this. If you haven't been specific enough about what you need them to do, then that person can still be in that meeting going, wait, that was feedback. That was something I was meant to do. I thought, there's no confusion there. It's very clear. There's clarity right there.
Yeah, that's this balance between care and directness.
Yeah, exactly. The cruel to be kind sort of situation.
Yeah.
So what do you think the biggest challenges that leaders are facing right now from your experience over the last year or two? What are the biggest things that are coming out that leaders across the board are experiencing, and what could they be doing to maybe address those?
I think in the end, if you look across the years, the challenges just get different labels, but they're not that different. So we had a bunch of years where diversity, equity, inclusion was very high on the radar of leaders, and then there's innovation. Even before that, I think innovation was a bit before that, when digital and tech had their first boost. And then at some point, diversity, equity, inclusion got a backlash, and then it became neurodiversity at some point. And nowadays, I hear more empathy, leading with empathy. But in the end, it's still the same thing, where if you're not conscious as a leader, then what happens in your organization is you have a certain structure, you have the KPIs, you have the reward system, and those together define most of the behaviors that happen in the organization. And the reality is the KPIs have their limitations, because not everything is as easy to measure as other things. I use an exercise where I use 3 universal limitations of data. And the first one is long-term impact is always harder to estimate than short-term impact. Second one is optimizing impact in silos is easier than optimizing across silos. And the third one is predicting what happens if you do something you never did before is harder than optimizing existing ways of working. So if you have a KPI sheet that you use to optimize the behavior of a team, of an organization, and you're not very conscious about these limitations, those KPIs are going to reward short-term behavior, siloed behavior, or even worse, competition between teams, and they're going to reward people investing in existing streams at the cost of innovation. And it's from that all these challenges come. So if you think about the challenge of innovation comes from that problem. Any long-term investment, people not investing in the long-term at the cost of opportunistic short-term gains, comes from there. And all the investments where people do something that is good for team culture, team effectiveness, also come from that particular source. So the leadership challenge is to be aware, okay, there's no way you can just run an organization based on KPIs and a performance system. You're going to have to be conscious about these gaps, which is long-term, holistic versus siloed, competition versus collaboration, and new things versus existing things. And then fill those gaps essentially with your leadership style. I call that leading with data, mind, and heart. So data, yes, important, but it starts with understanding where it doesn't work. That's the only way you can make good data-driven decisions. And then the bit about holistic and long-term needs to be filled based on a solid long-term strategy, preferably 3 years ahead or so, based on a very solid mission where you clearly state this is why we exist, this is what we do, what we don't do. And then that strategy needs to be specific enough so that when you translate it down layer by layer, every layer can look up at it and say, okay, if the company is going there, then my team is going there. And then the layer below. And so you try to trickle it down until the level of an individual. And if you have KPIs only without a very good, clear, holistic strategy with a certain horizon, then the thing that is easy to measure, it's optimization KPIs, sales, revenue, that type of stuff. But that doesn't translate to all roles. So you end up cascading downwards, and then you can only give clarity of structure and direction to 1/3 of your roles, and 2/3 of them who have all kinds of supporting functions. They don't see how their work relates to whatever company strategy you're setting. So holistic long-term strategy, and then data, mind, heart. So heart is essentially doing the right thing. So knowing what kind of culture you want to have, knowing what kind of impact you want to have for the world. Then there's certain things you just do them out of principle and not because someone can prove the impact.
I guess if you're too busy on the KPIs, you're too busy on the measurables because they're easy to measure against something. If that's how you're measuring success, then it is going to drive, like you said, that short-mindedness, that idea of, okay, well, if we do X, we're going to get this many more sales. And if that's all you're doing, then, like you said, the support structure, the HR team, the development and growth, where do they fit into that performance review process that's going to come out of those KPIs?
Yeah, and the thing is, this is again one of these topics where leaders say all of these things are important, but when you look at the reality, the KPI sheets, what's rewarded, etc., they say people are first, and all leaders say, I care about my team. But then if you look at how a leader is rewarded, if a person hits KPIs while burning out the team, the odds are very high that this person can get a promotion. Like very few companies have upward feedback from teams towards their managers. And even if they have it, they're often not using it in the decisions about opportunities for a manager. So if a leader, like a CEO, says to their company, people are first, teams matter, long-term strategy matters, but then wherever you are in the organization, if I hit KPIs, I get promotion, even if it means I burnt out the team, then they just know, well, you're saying it's important, but we know it's not. And so they're not going to act in line with whatever you're saying. So if you say long-term strategy is important, if you say people are important, then you must, in KPI dashboards and performance evaluations, you must give equal weight to all of these things. So you must say, well, if you hit your KPIs, but your manager scores are way too low and you're not improving them, you won't get a bonus, you can't get promoted. And that's when people know, okay, they're equally important. If you hit your short-term KPIs, but always at the cost of long-term roadmap, that also needs to have some kind of consequence.
And it's that idea that we develop the people because they're going to get the results as well. So it's not just I'm going, okay, you need to make X amount of sale calls this quarter. It's actually, okay, what can I do to make sure that your working environment and how you're feeling about coming to work is a positive, so that then they can then go ahead and actually make those calls. Each call is better because they're in a better mind space. It's this idea that actually it's untangible. You can't score it 1 out of 10. But actually, what you're saying is actually these upwards reports, those people are going to score you. It becomes, there is now something measurable there.
Yeah. It also happens, there's more in this survival of the nicest organization, where you set certain goals and then people don't deliver, but they get away with it. So then it's more opposite. So if the people know, like, okay, we know the KPI exists, but we also know that we get away with not delivering. So I have an exercise that I use, and it's like we say, but. And we say is typically, we say people are important. We say hitting impact is important, but everybody actually knows. And so depending on the profile of organization, they might say, well, we say teams are important, but we know hitting KPIs is more important. Or the other way around, we say KPIs are important, but we all know that if you just hide, there's no problem.
That would be a fantastic survey to send out to everyone in an organization. All it has is 2 boxes, we say, and they fill that box in, and just see what everyone in the organization actually.
And it's surprisingly consistent what comes out. Everybody knows.
Throughout this conversation, I've written down a couple of words which I think are values that you bring into your leadership. I just think where it might be useful to reflect back to see if you agree with what I've observed from this conversation. So the first one I think I've already mentioned to you, it's intentionality. So what do you think about that one? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you take that whole system of discipline, there's no way you can create it if you don't first think really hard about, okay, what's the impact that we want to have? So it literally starts with like, okay, why does my team exist? What impact are we going to have? And that whole system of discipline is designed around that. So every step along the way is intentionality.
I've then got consistency.
Yeah, true. It's very much like if you say you're doing something, but you're doing it sometimes, but not always, like very often that means in reality, you're just not doing it. But like if you take safety as an example, if it's sometimes safe, sometimes not safe, it's just not safe.
There are times, I guess, within consistency, you might have a bad day.
Yeah.
But that once in a blue moon, it's not like once a week this is happening.
That's it. It makes a big difference. If people know this is not the normal, then an exception is no problem. But if they know the exception is actually the norm, they will know. Then the consistently is just not there, and then it just means you're not doing it.
So the next one I've got down is personal. So like the personal touch. You seem to really like that personal touch.
Yeah, true. Like the thought behind that is you want people to have impact based on intrinsic motivation. Like I don't want to be in a position where you have to micromanage people in order to do what they need to do for the organization. Because even if you get them to do it, they're never going to do it with the same amount of energy and impact versus what they would have done if it's based on intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, that's very true. One, I think everyone listening will go, yeah, this sounds like you, hands down, is a structured approach. You like having a structure, putting that in place. And I think that goes alongside the consistency and intentionality, but having a structure.
Yeah, true. Like the structure is never a purpose in itself. So I always advocate for the minimum amount of structure that leads to consistency. The consistency is the goal.
I think that's important because a lot of people will think, oh, I need to build a structure, but actually that becomes so complex and so convoluted that actually no one understands what the structure is.
Yeah, like the example, if you take objectives, key results, like the first most made mistake is not writing them down. And the second most made mistake is making them too detailed. Like, so it becomes this admin process where everybody sighs already if they have to write down the OKRs every single quarter, like, and in the end, the OKRs, the only thing that's supposed to do is that you have the right conversations about cascading strategy across layers so that people know this is what I'm supposed to do. This is how it contributes to the team impact, and this is how the team contributes to company impact. That's the goal. And a certain amount of structure is needed, but if you make it too heavy, then people are just going to tick the admin box and the conversations don't happen.
And the last one I've got down is openness.
True. And that's also a tough one because you can't always be open. So there's certain things you will never be able to share, or there might be things that, if you would share it with your team, it would be just devastating for motivation. So you always have to juggle as a leader. Like, you want to be, the default is transparent, but there's just some stuff, where you think if I would share, it just wouldn't help. So I think the intentionality, genuinely helpful, is there to guide what you share, what you don't share. Default is sharing.
How would you go about sharing, or let's say not sharing? So you've been told some information that in your gut you want to share, but you know it will devastate the team. It could kill motivation. People will then suddenly feel insecure in their workplace or something. If you've got this piece of information, how would you go about dealing with that?
Yeah, so sometimes you think it will devastate the team. Like, I have a really good example of that, where I went through a period where I had a peer manager next to me, and that person joined our team. And within 9 weeks or so, like one by one, people started planning meetings with me about things that person was doing to them. And that became a pattern where this person was just deliberately attacking people with all kinds of strategies, very structured, to essentially undermine whoever was not contributing to his impact, and build his career through storytelling more than through impact. But they came to me one by one, not knowing about all the other cases. And they came to me because they feared going to HR, they feared going to our joint manager, they feared going to our vice president. So I actually saw the pattern quite quickly. And at that point in time, I felt like, well, if I just share with all of them, like, oh, listen, this is just a toxic person who is trying to hurt all of you, that would just be super demotivating. So at the time, I would just say, listen, I've heard your concern. I want you to know I'm not surprised. And then I would bring it to our joint manager. And that joint manager wasn't hearing me. So that joint manager at the time would say, oh, that's probably just a blind spot. I will give him some feedback. And that kept going for a year or so. And it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And so I escalated a level higher, wasn't being heard, escalated to HR, wasn't being heard. So at some point after a year of doing that, it started to weigh really heavy on me, and the cases were getting worse and worse and worse. So then I decided to just call my team together and say, listen, you have all come to me with stories. You think you are the only one, but you all have the same stories about the same person. I've escalated to this place, to that place, to that place, and I think they're not going to act on it. And so if you want to act on this, you are going to have to escalate to all of these people, preferably all at the same time. And you have to tell them the unfiltered story, because some people actually did, but they would give him the soft version because they feared giving him the full disclosed version. So you're going to have to give them the unfiltered story because they're not going to act if you don't. And then suddenly within like 3 weeks or so, all of them did this. And then it was taken serious. Then it still took a year to manage the person out. So in total, there was 2 years. And then later in the feedback I got from my team, from the manager feedback, they told me that they highly valued this moment of transparency. I still didn't tell them every single bit. There were still bits in there that I thought it would just be too devastating, but I gave them like the 80% version. And they highly valued the vulnerability I also demonstrated because it was burning me out too. And it was a risk also for me to share it with them because it might backfire to me because HR, VP, nobody was listening. So it could easily backfire on me. And so then actually sharing was a benefit. But maybe if I had shared it earlier, it would have been just harmful. So I think there's a certain optimum, and you have to assess that optimum at every single moment in time, and it changes over time.
I guess within that, part of the openness was you sharing your inability to be able to do anything about it. And actually, it came down to them to be able to do something about it. It was like, I've tried, but it's not within my capability to do anything about it. So it's now over to you. You have to then do this. So you've shared that vulnerability of your limitations, but you've also shared, as you said, 80%. You didn't give the bit at the top, which would have actually undermined, I guess, that moment that you created in that space.
Yeah, I think it was empowering for them.
So there's a couple of finishing questions that I always finish the podcast on. The first one is, what is the legacy that you're hoping to leave behind?
Well, the most beautiful thing you can leave behind is if you leave, the team just keeps running full steam. That's when you've built a strong team. So whoever picks it up after you then has a good job to take it to the next stage. But I think it's also longer than that. Like the way I look at the role of a leader is like you have these paths with you and your team members, with you and your colleagues, with you and your stakeholders, with your partners, your clients, and the professional journeys, they merge at a certain point in time. And you have an interaction with each other that creates a certain value in terms of output, but that also creates value in the connections you have, and how you grow and how you enjoy those moments. And when you do that well, when people leave that moment, so the paths will part their ways again, people will remember, okay, this is what it can be like. This is what a team can feel like. This is what a client relationship can feel like. And so it sets that bar forever. And so they will not tolerate anymore if it's worse somewhere else, and they're going to challenge it. So if you consistently do that, I think you create more people who have a higher bar, who challenge the environment if it doesn't reach that bar. And hopefully then more people experience such a moment.
So within your leadership development training that you provide, are you trying to create more of these environments, these little silos of this positive leadership that can then create an even wider impact than just you coming across people? It's actually those people that you come across can then come across other people.
Yeah, and specifically, I try to help them do it under pressure. It is very easy to say you need to have more empathy. It's very easy to say psychological safety is important. But there's not many people who have walked the talk in an extremely high pressure environment where you're always time poor, where doing the opportunistic thing is probably easier. And so I want to give those who have the heart in the right place the tools to do the right thing under any kind of pressure. And if I do so, I hope to positively change organizations.
So my next one is, what's your current goal that you're working towards right now?
Well, I started this journey almost 2 years ago now. And my main goal in terms of what I wanted to achieve with companies is these partnerships, the way I just described it, where one by one, I hope to give people better managers and leaders who create an environment where doing the right thing pays off, so that companies also create more value for the world around them and are a nicer place to work. So that also means that I needed to have longer partnerships than just a one-off training here and there. So that was one of the goals that I had. And also it means I didn't want to do isolated topics. So if a company comes to me, can you do a feedback training because the perf season is coming? I know I'm not going to change the organization with it. The only thing I achieve is a box-ticking manager. And so I essentially say, well, I don't do that. If I train, I want to be able to train also on goal setting, on this system of attention, of check-ins, and then fair, predictable performance evaluation. I want to do the whole thing because that's when I can genuinely change something. So I needed partnerships where I could have long-term partnership and train holistically, start as high as possible, reality is, if you have a company the size of Google, there's no way you can ever train the management team, but then you can still say, let's take a pocket of the company, start with the vice president and the team of directors, and then work your way down. So that's what I wanted to achieve. And that's now 2 years later, almost, I actually have that. So I have a nice range of customers varying from 50 to thousands of people, where I started with the management team. I do holistic things and I work my way downwards towards all team leaders, and I stay with them for a longer moment in time. And then the other goals I actually had was earn enough so I can keep doing it. And luckily, like Google was a good employer in terms of financially. So I saved lots of money. I don't need much. So it's quite easy to get to the point where we have the minimum we need. And that also means that if a company comes and they want something that I don't think is having the desired impact, I could just say, well, I don't do that. And so I've reached that point now where I know I can say no to everything I don't want to do. I only have collaborations that I believe have maximum impact. And then the final thing is working less. So I spend more time with my family, and I still have that. So I have a cadence now throughout the entire year where there's like 1 or 2 trainings a week or so, and coaching and things. I can bring my kids to school almost every day. I can fetch them from school almost every day. And then after school, I can spend some time with them. If that's nice, every now and then I have a full day training, so I'm gone. But most of the time I can do all of these things.
So how will you know that by the end of this year, let's say you're going to do like New Year's resolutions, how would you know that you've reached those goals and that you want to reevaluate and change those goals or keep those goals the same? What sort of signs would you have that says, okay, yeah, I've done great against these. I'm now going to change, or I'm going to re-establish those goals for next year?
I'm now a bit at the stage where I can start tweaking my energy. So I no longer have to chase for enough. Now I have how many trainings can I run in a week before it starts to feel like repetitive. And it seems to be there's an optimum of 1 or 2 trainings. And in the end, they're never fully the same because you always have to adapt it to the situation of the company. But for instance, if I would get an assignment where I have to train 1,000 managers in the same company in a very short time window, and they all go through the same program, then suddenly you start feeling like a training factory. So I'm figuring out like what's the optimal balance. Seems to be 1 or 2 full day trainings per week. I initially thought like I'm not going to do coaching because I didn't want to be this generic type of coach. Like I feel it's an overflooded market. But I've actually discovered after my trainings that managers became more conscious about sensitive moments with their team and the negative impact of getting it wrong, the positive impact of getting it right. So they came to me after trainings like, hey, I have this difficult situation with my team member, or I have to decide about the performance system of my company. So they would ask to plan an hour. And initially I just did those things as aftercare because they're also joyful to do. So I now made that a mix of what I do. Economically, it's less attractive, but it's very flexible work. It builds on the impact of the training. The people that come to you are the ones that actually are most motivated to do things well. And it's a source of loads of ideas of how I can help with my trainings. So I'm now tweaking that mix, so like how many full day trainings, how many coaching do I want to do, maybe a bit of consulting here and there. So I'm just like, hope next year is that year where I tweak the mix further. So it's a nice variation of work with a range of customers from commercial to nonprofit and anything in between. So I can see how the same principles apply in many different settings.
So for the last question, it goes almost full circle where we started with your story. And now we've got to here, we've sort of explored a large amount of your working life and what you've learned from it and what you now put in place. So if you were to go back now to a younger version of you and you were to have a conversation with that younger version of you, what bits of advice would you give to a younger you?
I think the biggest thing I feel that made my journey hard is that I've consistently underestimated myself. So I kind of assumed that everybody has the same level of discipline, that they only speak when they genuinely know their stuff. And therefore I ended up underestimating the value of what I can say. So I've gone through like 10 years at least where I never spoke up in meetings because I thought all the other people knew better. And I never liked doing presentations and I thought I wasn't good at it. And then like the first 10 years, I gradually trained myself to do presentations, I gradually trained myself to speak in meetings without getting heartbeat and sweaty palms. And I've actually discovered when I did speak up that there's value in it for people around me. So I think if anything, I would have hoped that I can show myself earlier how I can create value and what kind of positive impact that can have, so that it would have been easier to get over those hurdles.
Do you think that would have made a difference to where you've ended up, though, if you knew that early on? Do you think you needed to go through those moments of, increased heartbeat, sweaty palms? Do you think they were actually forming moments that formed who you are now?
I think in the end, it helped me empathize with anyone who struggles to speak up, or anyone. Well, for instance, if you're a female in a white male leadership team, it's just extremely hard to speak up. And so just having gone through a phase like that, and I happen to have the privilege of being white male, physically a large person. So if I speak up, people typically listen. Somehow I still had that barrier, that relates a bit to my past. And it took me 10 years to overcome it. But imagine if I would have been like a black woman, still not being heard, even though you try, and then suddenly it would have been different. So I think going through that helps me empathize with all the types of people who do not seem to fit the mold of whatever is there, and how much of a struggle it can be to feel seen, accepted, to be impactful, etc.
I think that's a really good point to finish on. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I have actually thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. We've gone to so many places and I have made lots of notes, and I have ticked off a lot of things that I wanted to talk about. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your ideas and what you've learned along the way.
Thank you too. And very thoughtful questions and observations and the key items. You nailed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And until next time, remember, to lead requires us to continuously